Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis. I want to talk a little bit today about Pascal's wager and climate change. Pascal's wager is named after a mathematician, a French mathematician from the 17th century, Blaise Pascal. He was a mathematical genius. He began the studies, or what led to such things as probability theory and game theory, and also eventually calculus. Blaise Pascal was a Roman Catholic Christian. He converted, and he was quite dedicated to the idea of convincing people that there was a God and that they should act in particular very Christian ways. But Pascal was also a mathematician and logician, and he understood very well that the logical arguments for the existence of God did not hold up to logical, rational thought. So Pascal decided to go about an argument that would convince people to act as if there were a God, whether they really believed that or not. And it's called Pascal's wager. And the wager goes like this. Let's say we flip a coin. Now, there is a God or there is not a God. There is a God or there is not a God, heads or tails. 50-50 chance even. Now, let's say that there is a God and we act as if there is a God, and we do the things that we are told to do within the religion. Bing, bing, we win. Heads, we win, because we have acted as if there's a God, and there is a God, so we are rewarded with eternal bliss in the heaven that is taught in Roman Catholicism in Pascal's time. That's one way that the game can happen. Or let's say there's not a God, tails. There's not a God. But we act as if there is a God anyway. What do we lose, Pascal says? What do we lose? So isn't it safer to bet that there is a God, even if there isn't? Sure, you have to live up to certain standards and you have to go to church fairly often, but you won anyway because you had your life and all is well. Or, said Pascal, and he wasn't talking about a three-headed coin, the other option is that we act as if there is not a God, but there is. What happens then? What if we wager that there is not a God, but there is? Sad music, we are sent to eternal damnation. So, said Pascal, you have to play this game whether you like it or not. It's heads or tails. It's safer to bet that there is a God than to bet that there is not a God. And that is Pascal's wager. And by arguing this, he is saying to us that we need to act in a particular way that was the thought of his time. And it's a fairly good argument when you stop to think about it. One of the things that it does is it lays out the idea that there is a punishment, and you could get that punishment if there happens to be a God that you don't believe in. Well, the interesting thing about Pascal's wager is that it doesn't really hold up to the kind of probability theory or game theory that Pascal hoped that it would. It's not quite as convincing as it at first appears to. And the reason for that is what is known as the anthropic principle, which is another principle of mathematics, but that came along long after Blaise Pascal was alive. The anthropic principle goes like this. What are the odds? What is the mathematical odds that the kind of God that Blaise Pascal was taught to believe in and that he based his wager on, what are the mathematical odds that that is the kind of God that actually exists. Now think about that for a moment. What about other kinds of Christianity? Protestantism, for example. What about the kinds of Christianity that argued that everyone goes to heaven, no matter what they do? Well, Pascal is saying that's not right. My form of Roman Catholicism here in France is the one that you need to bet on with this heads or tails. That's one problem with the argument. Another problem with the argument is, what if the kind of God that Pascal believed in isn't the right God at all? Because he was born in France, after all. That's a mathematical thing. What are the odds that that particular God is correct instead of, say, the Polynesian island god or gods? What about the Mayan gods? Couldn't they be just as well the 50-50 wager that Pascal puts on us? That is the anthropic principle. It's mathematical, and it does make Pascal's argument fairly unlikely mathematically. What are the chances out of all the gods in the world that the one Pascal believed in was the correct God? That's the anthropic principle. So Pascal's wager doesn't really hold up to the logic that he had hoped that it did. But I would argue, however, that maybe Pascal's wager makes some sense in other circumstances, and the one I've been thinking about recently is global climate change. Is there a wager on global climate change? Is there a heads or a tails about the human activity that changes the climate that is going to lead to the bad things that we read about? Rising sea levels, microclimates in which invasive species are suddenly able to live in climates in which they at one time were not able to do. Increased freeze and thaw cycles that will bust up bridges and roads. Heat waves that will kill animals, as has happened several times in the recent decade. What if those things really are being caused by human activity? Is there a climate change wager that says, yes, humanity is changing the climate, and no, humanity is not changing the climate? Flip it, and what would happen? Well, this is one of the ways that we know that the opponents of global climate change are not really serious about their objections to global climate change, because, frankly, there is a wager there, and unlike Pascal's wager, losing this one is going to be very, very dangerous for humanity. And so it's something to think about. And along those lines, when I reflect on this, progressives and liberals, we aren't very good at using fear factor very well. Pascal's wager really is based on fear of eternal damnation in case there is a God such as the one that Pascal argues that there is. It's a fear factor that's built into that assumption. Liberals, we aren't so very good at using fear. As a matter of fact, Franklin Roosevelt, the president, when he was first elected, says all we have to fear is fear itself. And as a liberal, I would say he set that up as a way of saying, fear is not the main motivating force of people when they actually think about stuff. So that's a progressive and liberal problem. We see a problem, and then we educate ourselves about the problem, and then we discover ways of fixing that problem, and then because we have reasoned our way into the solution, we think that other people should be reasonable and consider our solution just as we do. And then we are shocked when some people say, no, wait a minute, that's crazy, that's not reasonable. Yes, it is, we say, because we went through the steps of logic and reason to get to that point. But often, opponents of liberalism are motivated by other things. Short-term gains in economics, for example. Yes, climate regulations of the type that would stop global climate change would cost businesses money and time, and therefore some people would not want to do that. So they will say, nope, that's not happening. But again, we can be fairly sure they're not serious about that objection, because there really is a wager on climate change. Either humanity is changing the climate by what we're doing, or we are not. And if we are, we're in trouble. And if we're not, oh well, we had a few regulations, spend a little money to fix things, but no big deal. Interesting the way that is working out, right? Well, so our conservative opponents tend to use fear very, very well. Think about death panels. Think about black helicopters that are going to come sweeping down. Those are things that we are afraid of, that scare us. And reason, logic, oh, that's kind of boring, isn't it, to do? So it doesn't sell as well. It doesn't sell newspapers to be logical. Why can't people just be logical? Often liberals and progressives will say, well, for one thing, we really aren't wired that way, are we? We're really not wired to be reasonable. Think, for example, about the evolutionary life of humanity. So you're walking along out in the woods, and you see a snake right in front of you. What happens? Adrenaline rush, the hairs on your arms stand up, you jump aside, and the snake doesn't bite you, right? Fear, reaction, and you're not hurt. Well, what happens if maybe that was a stick in the path or a piece of rope? Well, nothing bad happens there because you don't die. The snake wasn't there and the rope won't bite you. So the fear response came, but you didn't get hurt, and so the fear response doesn't damage you anyway. And so that's what happened in our evolution. We were saved from actual fearful things to happen to us, and those times when we misused or mistook and were fearful, it didn't hurt us anyway, so what's the problem, right? And so in evolutionary time, humanity spent a great deal of time doing well by being afraid, the fight or flight mechanism that makes people get out of the way so that they don't get bitten by snakes. This is called fast thinking by a psychologist and economics professor by the name of Daniel Kahneman. This is fast thinking. This is intuitive thinking. This is thinking with our gut. Adrenaline, fear, getting out of the way, fast thinking. Kahneman argues that we have another system that also operates for us, and that is that thing I was calling reason, that thing called logic. That's the slow system, but it's not the automatic system. It's not the system that saves us from snakes. So what tends to happen to us is we operate on the fear system, the fast one, and then only later do we go to the rational system in order to think through what happened. Why was that like that? Okay. Now, since we have these two systems, we have two ways of thinking about things, but we depend upon the fast thinking first in order simply to save our lives. But what happens to us when we are, let's say, on the telephone, on hold, we feel angry because something has happened, the computer isn't working and we can't get an answer, and here we are on hold. So our adrenaline is pumping, the hairs on our arms are standing up, fear response. What does that do? Well, the only thing that that's really doing for us is damaging our system, because that fear response shuts down our digestive system. It makes our hearts race and our blood pressure rise because we want to be ready to run. So all it does is damage our health when we're on the phone having a fight or flight way of thinking. So we have problems then in separating out what should be slow thinking and what should be fast thinking. All right? For example, the journalist Daniel Gardner published a wonderful book called The Science of Fear: How the Culture of Fear Manipulates Your Brain. And this is a quote from Gardner's book. If the history of our species were written in proportion to the amount of time we lived in each stage of development, this is evolution, 200 pages would be devoted to the lives of nomadic hunter-gatherers. One page would cover agrarian societies. In the world of the last 2 centuries, the modern world would get one short paragraph at the end. A nice little metaphor for thinking about how we evolved. 200 pages as hunter-gatherers, 1 page as farmers, agrarians, and 1 short paragraph for our modern world. Well, what that really means is we are not wired. We have not evolved to live in the circumstances that we now live in. Our minds, our fast thinking, our intuition actually damages the way we operate in the world. It makes us make bad decisions and makes us unhappy and unhealthy. Here's an example. Think about the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. 2 airplanes crash into buildings in New York, and people watched those images over and over and over again. After September 11th, 2001, Americans began to be very careful about getting on airplanes. And for about a year, many people who should have taken airplanes actually drove automobiles. Well, automobiles are much more dangerous as a form of transportation. So what happened in that year in which people were afraid to fly? Well, about 1,600 people died in automobile accidents the year after the 9/11 attacks. About 1,600 people died needlessly because their wiring, their evolution told them that getting on an airplane was a fearful thing. So they didn't do it. And actually, it killed them. The same thing is true of guns. The number 1 most likely person to be killed by a gun that comes into someone's house is the person who bought the gun and brought it into the house. The number 1 most likely victim is the person who buys the gun. The number 2 most likely victim is the spouse of the person who bought the gun. And the number 3 most likely victims are family members of the person who bought the gun. And the chances that a gun owner will kill an intruder in their house is very, almost infinitesimally small. For one thing, people don't break into houses when they know someone's home. So there are very few break-ins that could be in any way prevented by that. Also, the fact is that when someone does kill an intruder, it makes the news. When someone commits suicide with a handgun, it doesn't make the news usually. And often when a spouse kills a spouse with a gun, it's investigated very quickly. Pretty simple what happened. And the person goes to jail and we forget about that. So protection is not really what a gun coming into the house is all about. It's our wiring. We get it wrong. We feel safer with a gun when really we are considerably less safe with a gun. Diabetes in the United States kills 1.5 times more Americans than automobile accidents. But Americans are much more afraid of automobile accidents than they are afraid of diabetes. Why is that true? Well, we see car accidents on the television news, we read about them in newspapers, we see them when we're on the highway. We don't tend to see people dying of diabetes unless we actually know that person. And so it seems to us that automobiles are very, very dangerous and diabetes is not a threat, when really it's the opposite way around. The fact is that our brains get it wrong. We have wiring that just doesn't tell us the real danger that's out there. This is what Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is really talking about. Also, Kahneman talks about what he calls a focusing illusion. And Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize in economics for his research. And it is in economics, and much of his argument has to do with how we can sell people things by using the evolutionary wiring of people so that they can be tricked or fooled into thinking that something is important enough to buy. Kahneman is not recommending that we do that. He's pointing out the fact that it does happen if we don't think about it. So, focusing illusion. What Kahneman did in order to research this is he asked college students 2 questions, and half of the students were living in the Midwest, and the other half of the students were living in California. He asked them 2 questions. The first question was, are you happy? Are you happy? And the second question was, will you be more happy if you stay or move to California? Well, the results, of course, are predictable. The Midwestern students and the Californians both reported being the same level of happiness. They were equally happy. But when the second question was asked, a focusing illusion occurred in which Midwesterners began to think about how much better the weather in California is. And so they got it in their heads to say that moving to California would make them happier. Whereas students in California, even remaining in California, was not part of their thinking, and they did not think that it would make them more happy. A focusing illusion. Kahneman argues that this can be used for marketing. You can be convinced by a focusing illusion to think that a particular car will make you more happy than it actually would, because you begin to think just about the car and just about what that would do for you, instead of thinking about the larger level of your happiness and what makes you happy. You can be sold a particular house, you can be sold a particular set of clothing, etc., by telling you that this particular thing will make you happy. It's a focusing illusion. And of course, Pascal's wager was also based on a focusing illusion, that is, fear of the afterlife and eternal punishment. So Pascal used a focusing illusion to make us think that this is far more important than it actually was. A focusing illusion. So the problem that we have in our thinking as human beings is that we evolved in a particular climate, a particular set of circumstances that we no longer live in. And our wiring gets it wrong when we think fast instead of thinking slow. We don't have the proper reaction to the stimulus. We have fight or flight instead of slow, rational thinking. To go back to the 9/11 example for just a moment, the people who actually saw the airplanes about to hit the buildings were very smart to be fearful. That was a good response, and those who were able to run away, good response, saved their lives. But for the people who lived 100 miles away watching the television, the people who watched those images living 1,000 miles away or 3,000 miles away, watching the images on television, feeling that they were immediate, actually forced them into a fear response that killed them because they didn't want to get on airplanes. Their wiring got it wrong. They were thinking fast when they should have been thinking slow. Again, governments, much like individuals, are much better at thinking fast than at thinking slow. They're much better at making fast arguments. There's a danger out there, let's get together. So remember the Alamo, or remember Pearl Harbor, or there are weapons of mass destruction. Those are fearful things. Governments can use those to motivate people. They work very well. But governments are not good, just as we aren't, most of us, good at thinking slow, thinking about what can we do now to prevent a problem 5 years from now or a decade from now. And of course, this is exactly the problem with global warming. It's something that's happening extraordinarily slow, and so for most of us, it isn't all that apparent. And of course, we can also be fooled with a focusing illusion, because if I don't want you to regulate my factory, I can say, focus on the fact that we always come up with new technologies. We people are so smart. Don't you think we'll come up with something to solve global warming before it becomes a real problem? Focus on that illusion instead of fixing the problem now. Is global warming happening? Maybe it really is a wager, heads or tails. And maybe we really have to bet on one of those. It does appear that we do. It does appear that we do. Is it just a theory? Well, that's one of the things about science. Again, I mentioned the fact that progressives and liberals tend to try to reason our ways out of arguments. Science also is extraordinarily careful about what it says and what it claims. So yes, global climate change is just a theory. But so is the theory of evolution, and so is the theory of gravity. But do we see very many people saying, oh, gravity, it's just a theory. I don't think I need to bother not jumping off this particular building. That's one of the issues. So when we look at what's really happening in the world, I think that perhaps fear is beginning to set in a little bit with global climate change, because we saw a massive hurricane, for example. We are beginning to see the heat rise, even in places, northern climes like Minnesota. We're seeing more and more microclimates. We're seeing more and more farmers who have their neighbor down the road with plenty of rain because of downfalls, and up close to us, didn't rain at all. So we're beginning to have that fear factor. But again, the climate wager, I think it might be time to say, you know what, I'm going to bet that human beings are indeed changing the climate. And I think I'm going to change the way I'm living. Thinking fast and thinking slow. It's good to think fast. It saves us some time when snakes are about to bite. But we need to think slowly, sometimes about some very serious issues. I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society. Would love to see you sometime, and thanks so much for listening today.